The economic convulsions that racked Western societies between the two world wars were seen at the time by most Marxists as being the breakdown of the capitalist system which Marxist theory had always predicted. However, whereas according to the theory this was supposed to lead to communism, in not one single such Western society did communist regimes emerge. What did emerge in several of them was fascism. Some Marxists were disillusioned by this, to the point of abandoning Marxism. Others refused to question Marxist theory regardless of what actually happened. But there were many in between, people who remained or wanted to remain Marxists, but who felt that Marxism would have to be seriously re-examined if it was to continue to remain credible. One such group of people came together in Frankfurt in the late 1920s and have come to be known since as the Frankfurt School. Actually, they didn't stay in Frankfurt long, but the name has stuck. They left Germany in the early 1930s, in the period just before and after the Nazis came to power, and by the mid-30s the key figures had all settled in the United States. These, to mention three, were Adorno, a man who seemed equally at home in philosophy, sociology and music; Horkheimer, a philosopher cum sociologist, less brilliant than Adorno but perhaps more solid; and the one who has turned out in the end to be the most famous and influential of them all, the political theorist Herbert Marcuse. Their influence grew slowly, but grew nevertheless over a long period and reached a spectacular peak in the 1960s. Many things contributed to this. One was the powerful revisionist movement among Marxist in communist countries throughout Eastern Europe, culminating in the Prague Spring of 1968. This put the Frankfurt School in line for the first time with real-life developments inside the communist world. Another, obviously related, was the tremendous revival of interest in Marxism among people in the West, especially educated young people. This also culminated in 1968, the year which saw the high point of student violence all over Europe and the United States, and looked for a moment in Paris as if it might even come close to genuine revolution. The would-be revolutionaries of that day proclaimed one man more than others as their political mentor, and that was Marcuse. They painted the walls with phrases from his books in order to make it known to the world that they were going to turn his ideas into reality. And although the revolution didn't materialize, during the decades since then, the ideas of Marcuse and the Frankfurt School have come to dominate some of the social science departments in various countries in Europe, and through them to have a continued and very important influence on the young. Professor Marcuse, why should it have been to your writings that the revolutionary student movements of the 1960s and early 70s turned?
Well, I was not the mentor of the student activists of the 60s and early 70s. What I did is formulate and articulate some ideas and some goals that were in the air at that time. That is about it. The student generation that became active in these years did not need a father figure or a grandfather figure in order to lead them to protest against a society which revealed daily its inequality, injustice, cruelty, and its general destructiveness. They could experience that. They saw it before their own eyes. As features of the society, I only mention the heritage of fascism. Fascism was militarily defeated. The potential for a repetition was still there. I would like to mention racism, sexism, the general insecurity, the pollution of the environment, the degradation of education, the degradation of work, and so on and so on. In other words, what exploded in the 60s and early 70s was a blatant contrast between the tremendous available social wealth and its miserable, destructive, and wasteful use.
So we were looking at the interview between Professor Brian McGee, and he's a philosopher, and Herbert Marcuse, who is or was a really a philosopher as well, but he introduced some new concepts in terms of philosophy. So
did he create the term cultural Marxism?
No, and in fact, there are persons who believe that term really refers to
by conservatives.
By conservative, and not only that, but the whole concept of cultural Marxism is fiction and fantasy.
Okay, so what did Marcuse call his concept? Because he must have had a concept. What name did
he called it Marxism.
Marxism,
but
Marxism.
You see what happened? You see,
but he recognized it wasn't the same old Marxism that existed when Marx was around. So
no,
it was a different form.
It was a different form in that Marx, if you recall, occurred in the 1900s, when the Industrial Revolution was just about taking place, and you had the workers who were slaves, quote unquote, for the owners of production. So the owners of production lived well,
the oppressors,
and the workers were poor.
Oppressed. Yes.
Now, one of the things that happened is that after World War I, the Marxist theory suggested that all the workers of the world would unite. And they would unite against the oppressors who were the owners of production. But instead of French workers uniting with German workers and so on, the British workers fought against the German workers. And that threw Marxist theory of workers rising up against the owners of production into chaos. So some Marxist thinkers, formed this school called the Frankfurt School.
So it was formed in Germany?
In Germany, to look in the 1920s to see, well, what happened? Because instead of there being
predicted did not happen.
Marxist revolution, you had the rise of fascism. So you had
and there was still patriotism to your country, and you fought for your country against other workers in the same situation.
Absolutely, and that just didn't make sense in Marxist theory. So the Frankfurt School was formed by persons from Germany, mainly from Germany, who were going to look as to why it is that Marxism, economics, traditional Marxism, didn't do what it was supposed to do. But in the Germany in the 1920s, going to the 1930s, something happened. Hitler, the fascism and the Nazi fascism started. So they had to leave Germany and they went to America.
Okay.
So the members of the Frankfurt School went to America, and significant among them was the one who really captured the minds of the students in the universities and so on in the 1960s was Herbert Marceuse,
who we heard in the interview.
And what he was saying is that, listen, you have to adjust Marxism. He didn't want to give up on Marxism. You have to adjust it.
It has to move with the times.
To
change.
To accommodate the reality of what happened in the war and the reality of what was facing people in the industrialized society who were consuming more, but there was still issues of
oppression,
racism, sexism. Now, if you hear me, those are the same words that the young one of the protesters at Milo in California and Berkeley used. She used the same words: racism, sexism. That is the link, in that you're not just being oppressed now because of economics, but you are being oppressed because of certain cultural considerations.
Well, yes.
So this is where the term cultural Marxism comes from.
So he didn't invent the term, but he certainly had the concept, the idea that, look, the Marxist idea of purely economic grounds for differences between persons
and oppression
having been eliminated and having been made irrelevant by the First World War, we now have to find a different way to express the antagonism between groups of persons, even to encourage it, I think, because you still have to identify one group as the oppressed and another group as the oppressors, and not on purely economic grounds.
Right.
So it was a way of changing Marxism to make it still relevant.
Well, yes.
To maintain the relevance of Marxist thought in a new paradigm. That's what I think.
No, but it's true. But there is some truth to the analysis in that in sociology there's the concept of majority and minority groups. The majority group is not necessarily the group with the numbers, but it's the group with the power. And so in bringing Marxist analysis out of economics and bringing it into the other concept of social and cultural, you now have much more problems that you can identify.
And you have many more oppressed groups to identify.
And in fact, that is where the whole concept of what's called identity politics
comes
about.
Which we're going to talk about as well.
Identity politics. So cultural Marxism, although like I said, people on the left seek to dismiss it as though it's a conspiracy theory or something that doesn't really exist. It does exist, and it exists in the universities. The humanities departments of many Western universities basically are involved not simply in teaching about, but they are actively
you can
engaged.
say not at all in teaching about, but mainly in indoctrinating persons along those principles.
Yeah.
And you can argue about the name, cultural Marxism, but the fact of the thing, the actuality of the thing, you simply have to observe what goes on. So you can argue about the name all you want, but is there a set practice deliberately in the humanities faculties in universities, Western universities, to indoctrinate students, to reject contending ideas, and to have a monolithic kind of thinking. They who talk about diversity, they want a one way of thinking. So they encourage a diversity of behavior or of dress, but it must be no diversity in thinking. Nobody can deny that this exists.
And like I say, I just want to repeat, because today, for those who, if you've come in late, what we are talking to what we call the closing of the university mind. We are seeing why it is that when people go to universities, they come back in a way that is intolerant of any kind of thinking. And
opposite to what they
And the reason is that universities, Western universities, in the humanities department, humanities and so on, they do not teach politics.
Or even how to think.
Or the critical analysis of politics. What they do, they teach cultural Marxism. And the indoctrination into cultural Marxism. So there is no, there's no sit down and say, well, let's look at how this started, how that started. Let us analyze this idea. Let us analyze what are the pros and cons of this. No. In places like at the University of California, Berkeley, what they teach is how to be a cultural Marxist. And in fact, you were to go there and do something else, you couldn't survive.
You could be seriously harmed.
You could be seriously harmed.
Yes.
So this is the closing of the university mind that we are seeing. That cultural Marxism, Western universities, in their humanities, government department, sociology department, are really not teachers of those of politics, but they are political entities advocating for. That's what Western universities are.
They have adopted a dogma, and they indoctrinate the students into this
dogma.
Students are not taught, this is how you think about these
about politics.
This is how you analyze politics. These are the ground rules for analyzing it. These are some of the political facts that we know have occurred historically. They are taught, this is how it is, and everyone else. So if you are pro-life, you are an oppressor.
That's right. That's
it.
So the students are being taught in these universities to be political activists and advocates.
Yes. That's for one point of view.
One point of view.
Monolithic.
That Wilmot Perkins used to say that the University of West is the intellectual ghetto. And a ghetto really is a place that has only one type of people, like the Polish ghettos. In the Polish ghettos in World War II, they were mainly Jews. It referred to the Jews. It didn't necessarily mean that it was a place of poverty, but it was a place of isolation. And what Perkins was seeking to say is that with respect to some aspects of political activity in the 1970s, the University of the West acted like an intellectual ghetto. In other words,
embracing one kind of thought.
It acted like a monolith. And in fact, you will find that you will not find many Western universities providing critique of things like feminism or LGBT, because they are in fact the advocates
of that worldview
in the context of identity
and their
politics.
role is to prevent the students from being even exposed to the alternate view.
That's right.
It's to prevent exposure to it.
Or to think critically about it.
Because I've seen in universities in the United States, for example, somebody comes here to speak about, let us say, Israel or something. That's another thing.
Shut it down.
Or they beat drums and they shout out and they cannot speak. So it is to prevent even exposure to an alternate worldview. And one of the terms we'd have to talk about is the term called identity politics. Because identity politics is one of the forces that is used to lock down thoughts.
Well, and there's also a use of tolerance. But let us let the listeners see exactly what cultural Marxism.
Yeah, what is cultural
what
Marxism?
Is cultural Marxism?
And as you think about the first video we showed, in that how it, the outcomes of it.
Yes.
So what is it? How
What
did
is
it
cultural
start?
Marxism?